It was a night like any other. The sound of tapping keys filled Claire's small apartment as she worked on her laptop. Outside, the city was alive with distant traffic and the occasional shout of pedestrians. But inside, Claire was safe, or so she thought. Her phone buzzed on the desk, its screen lighting up with an unfamiliar notification. She squinted at it, confused. It wasn't a message, at least not from any app she recognized.
"You've been invited to play. Do you accept?"
The words were bold, almost taunting. She stared at the screen, unsure if it was a prank, a spam ad, or some kind of phishing attempt. Without much thought, she ignored it and went back to her work. But within seconds, her laptop chimed. The same message appeared there, this time flashing in the center of her screen.
"You've been invited to play. Do you accept?"
A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't normal. Closing out the browser didn't help. The message remained, pulsing like a heartbeat. Claire hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Maybe it was a game. One of those viral marketing stunts designed to go viral through social media. But how had it gotten onto both her phone and laptop? Curiosity got the better of her. She tapped her phone, her finger lingering over the word, accept. After a deep breath, she pressed it. Immediately, both her phone and laptop screens went black. Claire blinked, startled, as text began to appear, first on her phone, then syncing across her devices.
"Welcome, Claire Matthews. The game begins now."
Her heart raced. They knew her name. Her phone dinged again with the first question.
"What is the capital of Spain?"
Claire frowned. This was basic trivia. She typed Madrid and hit send. Correct. The relief was brief. The next message appeared almost instantly.
"Dare. Leave your apartment, go to the nearest convenience store and steal something."
Her breath caught in her throat. Steal? This had to be a joke. She closed the app, shaking her head. No way was she going to steal something. But a second later, her phone buzzed again, the notification more insistent this time.
"Fail to comply and you forfeit the game."
Forfeit? She tapped back into the app, looking for more details.
"One rule, if you stop playing, you die."
Claire stared at her phone, the words blurring before her eyes. This couldn't be real. People didn't die because of some twisted trivia game, right? It was probably a hoax, a prank set up by some anonymous hacker. But the pressure in her chest wouldn't let up. What if... She stood up, pacing her small living room. The game's text blinked insistently on her screen.
"If you stop playing, you die."
A mix of disbelief and fear crept over her. She went to the door and peered through the peephole, half expecting someone to be out there watching, waiting. The hall was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the lights overhead. It only made the situation feel more unreal, like she was trapped in some kind of nightmare. Her phone buzzed again.
"You have 10 minutes to complete the dare."
10 minutes. Claire's heart rate picked up. What if she didn't comply? Was there someone watching? Could they really do something to her? The rational part of her brain screamed that it was impossible. But then again, everything about this was impossible. Maybe if she just went to the store, pretended to do something, the game would let up. It couldn't hurt, right? Without overthinking it, she grabbed her coat and keys and stepped outside. The cool night air hit her as she made her way down the dimly lit street, the convenience store glowing in the distance like a beacon. Her phone vibrated again in her pocket.
8 minutes left.
Claire walked faster, her mind spinning with the absurdity of it all. This was ridiculous. She'd get there, buy something, and this stupid game would be over. The convenience store bell jingled as she stepped inside. It was mostly empty, save for the sleepy-eyed clerk behind the counter, who barely looked up from his phone. Claire pretended to browse the aisles, her stomach knotting tighter with each passing second. She reached for a small chocolate bar and slipped it into her pocket, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the crinkling wrapper. It was small, barely worth $1, but the act felt monumental.
5 minutes.
Claire glanced at the door, her heart pounding. Her palms were slick with sweat, her breath shallow. She could just walk out. No one would even notice. The game wouldn't actually do anything, right? With one last glance at the clerk, she hurried toward the exit, the weight of the tiny stolen chocolate bar heavy in her pocket. The bell chimed again as she pushed through the door and stepped back onto the sidewalk, her pulse racing. Her phone vibrated as she turned the corner.
Dare completed. Congratulations, Claire.
She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief flooded her for a split second before another message followed.
Next question. How many hearts does an octopus have?
What? There was another round? Her mind was still racing from the dare. She barely registered the trivia question. 3 hearts, right? She typed 3 and hit send.
Correct.
The app flashed again, and her stomach dropped as the next dare appeared.
Dare. Send a message to your ex. Apologize for everything.
Claire froze, staring at her phone. Her ex, the one she hadn't spoken to in over a year. She gripped the device tightly, her thoughts spiraling. Why was this happening to her?
You have 15 minutes.
Claire's pulse quickened as she read the words on the screen.
Send a message to your ex. Apologize for everything.
Everything? She hadn't spoken to Daniel in over a year, and there were a lot of reasons for that. Their relationship had ended badly. Shouting matches, silent treatments, and things left unsaid. She didn't owe him anything, especially not an apology, but the game didn't care about her feelings. She glanced at the clock. The app had given her 15 minutes, and 4 of them were already gone. A wave of anger surged through her. Why was she even entertaining this? A sick part of her wondered how far the game would go, but the rest of her just wanted it to stop. She opened her messaging app and scrolled down to Daniel's name. Her thumb hovered over the text box, her mind racing. What could she even say? Sorry for everything. Felt cheap and hollow, but that's all the game wanted, right? An empty apology. With a deep breath, she typed, "Hey, Daniel. I'm sorry for everything that happened between us. I know it's been a long time, but I just wanted to apologize for everything." She stared at the screen, debating whether to hit send. The seconds ticked by, each one making her more anxious. If she didn't send it, what would happen? The threat of death loomed, but it still felt impossible, like a bluff. Was it really worth reopening old wounds for a game she didn't understand? Her phone buzzed again.
6 minutes left.
Panic washed over her, and without thinking she hit send. Her heart sank the moment her thumb pressed the button. Almost instantly, the regret came crashing down. What if this stirred things up? What if Daniel replied? She stared at the screen, waiting for some kind of response from the game. The app remained quiet for a moment before flashing again.
Dare completed. Well done, Claire.
Claire let out a shaky breath. The feeling of relief was short-lived. Another message appeared.
Next question. Who painted the Mona Lisa?
This one felt easy, too. She typed, "Leonardo da Vinci," and hit send.
Correct.
Then came the dare.
Dare. Record a video of yourself breaking something valuable. You have 10 minutes.
Her mouth went dry. Break something valuable? The sinking feeling returned. Claire glanced around her apartment. What did she have that was considered valuable? She could smash an old vase or maybe one of the framed photos on the wall. But no, that didn't feel like enough. Her eyes landed on her laptop, her lifeline for work, her connection to the world. Her hands trembled at the thought. That couldn't be what the game wanted, could it? Her phone buzzed again.
9 minutes remaining.
Claire swallowed hard. The thought of smashing her laptop made her stomach churn, but the game didn't seem to leave her much of a choice. She rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a hammer from the drawer. Every step felt heavy, as if she were walking towards something she couldn't come back from. She set her laptop on the floor, staring at the screen that had just moments ago been showing her the game. Now, it felt like a curse, like the thing pushing her toward this insane decision. With one final deep breath, Claire raised the hammer and brought it down. The screen cracked, splintering with a sickening sound. She hit it again, the plastic casing snapping, pieces flying across the room. She stood back, panting, her heart racing. Her phone buzzed.
Dare completed.
She dropped the hammer, her body shaking with a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. What had she just done? The next question appeared.
How many bones are in the human body?
Claire didn't even want to think. Her fingers automatically typed 206.
Correct.
Her stomach knotted as the next dare appeared.
Dare, cut your hair at least 6 inches.
Claire stared at her phone, her reflection warping in the cracked screen of her ruined laptop. The absurdity of it all threatened to suffocate her. First, the theft, then breaking her laptop, and now this. Her hands reached for her hair, instinctively running through the long strands she hadn't cut in years. This wasn't a game anymore. It was control, manipulation. Her breathing grew shallow, the panic rising again. Her mind raced. Was it really worth this? The thought of quitting crept back, but the game's single rule loomed over her like a shadow. If you stop playing, you die. What if it was true? Could she risk it? She caught sight of herself in the mirror hanging on the wall. Her eyes were wide with fear, her face pale under the dim light. Claire felt trapped. Trapped in her own apartment, in her own head, and now even in her own body. She didn't want to do this. Her phone buzzed.
7 minutes remaining.
The countdown was merciless, like a ticking time bomb inside her chest. Claire rushed into the bathroom, yanking open the drawer under the sink. She fumbled through its contents until she found a pair of scissors. Her fingers trembled as she gathered a chunk of her hair in her hand. She glanced at her reflection again, feeling like she was losing more than just 6 inches of hair. The Claire staring back at her was someone she barely recognized anymore, scared, desperate, and slowly unraveling. Without giving herself more time to think, she raised the scissors and closed them around the strands. The sharp snip echoed in the small bathroom, and thick locks of her hair fell to the floor. She stared down at them, unable to process what she had just done. Her phone buzzed.
Dare completed. Congratulations, Claire.
She swallowed the lump in her throat and looked at the screen. There was no sense of victory, only the hollow feeling that she was being dragged deeper into something she couldn't escape. What would the next dare be? How far would this go? Before she could even brace herself, the next question appeared.
What is the largest mammal on Earth?
This one was easy, too. She typed, blue whale.
Correct.
The follow-up dare flashed on her phone almost immediately.
Dare. Stand in front of your window for 10 minutes, completely still.
Claire blinked. Her stomach twisted. What kind of dare was this? It seemed simple, but something about it made her uneasy. Why did the game want her to stand in front of her window, doing nothing? Her apartment was on the 2nd floor, and her window overlooked a busy street. People walked by all the time. Cars passed. Lights flickered in distant windows. She usually felt safe here, but now it felt like the game was watching her, like something or someone was out there, waiting. Her phone buzzed again, a reminder.
9 minutes left.
She approached the window, pulling back the curtain just a crack. The street below looked the same as ever, quiet, normal. But it wasn't the street that scared her. It was the idea of being exposed, of standing there like a target. Claire hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped forward. She stood directly in front of the window, her reflection staring back at her in the dark glass. Her heart hammered in her chest as she pressed her phone's timer. 10 minutes. She could do this. The first few seconds felt like an eternity. Every sound, every flicker of movement outside made her pulse quicken. She imagined someone watching from one of the nearby buildings, their eyes fixed on her as she stood motionless, vulnerable. 5 minutes in, her legs started to ache. Her thoughts spiraled, imagining all the worst-case scenarios. Was this leading up to something worse? Was someone about to knock on her door, waiting for her to break? The timer ticked down, and finally, mercifully, her phone buzzed again.
Dare completed.
She collapsed onto the couch, her entire body trembling. What was the point of this dare? Was it just to scare her, to make her feel powerless? The next question came up on her screen, cutting through her thoughts.
How many planets are in the solar system?
She typed 8.
Correct.
The dare that followed was worse than any before.
Dare. Go to your neighbor's apartment and knock 3 times. If they answer, don't say a word.
Her breath caught in her throat. No, she couldn't do that. That was insane. Her phone buzzed.
You have 15 minutes.
Claire sat frozen on the couch, her phone in her trembling hand. The dare stared back at her like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She had no idea how to handle this. The trivia questions were getting harder to focus on, and the dares were escalating, growing more personal, more disturbing. This one seemed designed to humiliate her, to push her past her limits. Why was the game so focused on making her interact with others, forcing her to act out of character? Her neighbor, Mrs. Emerson, was a sweet, elderly woman. Claire had only spoken to her in passing, a smile and a hello in the hallway. She couldn't just show up at her door, knock, and say nothing. Mrs. Emerson would think she'd lost her mind. But what if she didn't do it? The game's threat was always in the back of her mind. If you stop playing, you die. It was absurd, but after everything she'd done so far, after destroying her laptop, cutting her hair, standing exposed by the window, it didn't feel so absurd anymore. Her phone buzzed.
10 minutes remaining.
Claire stood up, her legs shaky. She had to move, had to keep playing, but each step towards the door felt like a betrayal of her instincts. Quietly, she slipped on her shoes and walked into the hallway, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Mrs. Emerson's apartment was just across the hall. Claire hesitated at her door, staring at the old wooden number 203 that seemed to mock her. She raised her hand to knock but froze, her breath shallow.
7 minutes remaining.
Her mind raced. What if Mrs. Emerson was asleep? Or worse? What if she opened the door and saw Claire standing there, a nervous wreck, and called the police? This wasn't like sending a message to her ex or standing in front of a window. This was real, face-to-face interaction. Her hand trembled as she finally mustered the courage to knock once. The sound echoed in the empty hallway. She waited, every second dragging out like hours. Knock, knock. 2 more knocks. Claire swallowed hard, her heart hammering in her chest as she waited for what felt like an eternity. Maybe Mrs. Emerson wouldn't answer. Maybe she was out, or asleep, or... The door creaked open, just a sliver, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Emerson stood there in her robe, squinting into the hallway. Her gray hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her wrinkled face was soft with confusion.
Claire?
She said, her voice gentle.
Is everything all right, dear?
Claire opened her mouth, but no words came. She felt the game's instructions weighing down on her, suffocating her. Don't say a word. Her jaw clenched as she stared at the kind old woman, her lips sealed tight. Panic surged through her veins. She couldn't even explain why she was here. Mrs. Emerson looked more concerned by the second.
Claire, dear, are you...
Claire shook her head, slowly, as if trying to say no without words. She took a step back, her heart in her throat, before turning and rushing back into her apartment. She slammed the door shut, her body shaking violently as she leaned against it. She felt nauseous, like she'd just crossed some invisible line. Her phone buzzed.
Dare completed. Well done, Claire.
The relief that usually followed the end of a dare was nowhere to be found. Instead, Claire felt like she was spiraling deeper into something she didn't understand. Her phone buzzed again.
Next question. What is the square root of 64?
She typed 8.
Correct.
The next dare appeared almost instantly.
Dare. Find something sharp and draw a symbol on your arm. A circle with a line through it. You have 10 minutes.
Claire's stomach turned. She dropped her phone onto the couch, her hand instinctively going to her arm. A symbol? Her fingers brushed over her skin and her mind screamed no. This wasn't a game anymore. This was something darker, something twisted. The thought of using something sharp, of marking herself. It felt like the game was trying to break her, bit by bit. Her phone buzzed again, the reminder of time ticking away, like a clock counting down to her doom.
8 minutes remaining.
She stood, walking into the kitchen on autopilot, her hand trembling as she opened the drawer and pulled out a small paring knife. It gleamed under the dull kitchen light, far too sharp for comfort. Her reflection stared back at her from the blade's surface, her eyes wide with terror. Could she really do this? Her phone buzzed again, relentless.
6 minutes.
Claire slowly rolled up her sleeve, exposing the bare skin of her forearm. The fear was overwhelming now, clawing at her throat, but the pressure of the game was even stronger. She gripped the knife, positioning the tip against her skin. The sharp sting of the blade barely registered at first. She drew the first curve of the circle, her breath hitching as a thin line of red followed the movement. The pain came in waves, but she pushed through, drawing the symbol exactly as the game instructed. When she finished, she dropped the knife onto the counter and stumbled back, staring at the crimson mark etched onto her arm. The room seemed to tilt as her vision blurred. Her phone buzzed one last time.
Dare completed.
But Claire felt no sense of accomplishment. She felt like she was losing herself, one dare at a time. Claire stared at the mark on her arm, the thin circle with a line slashed through it. Her skin throbbed with a dull ache, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging in her mind. She had crossed a line she never thought she'd cross. The game wasn't just testing her limits. It was breaking her down, inch by inch, pushing her to do things she couldn't even comprehend. She dropped onto the couch, feeling hollow, like the person she had been just a few hours ago was slipping away. How much further could she go? What would the game ask of her next? Would there be a next? Her phone buzzed again, breaking the silence.
Next question. In what year did the Titanic sink?
She blinked, her brain struggling to shift from the shock of the dare to the trivia question. She knew this one. Her dad had been obsessed with Titanic history. The year floated to the surface of her mind through the haze. She typed, 1912.
Correct.
Her body tensed, waiting for the next dare, dreading what it would be.
Dare. Leave your apartment and go to the rooftop. You have 10 minutes.
Claire frowned, her heart skipping a beat. The rooftop? That didn't sound too bad, but something about the simplicity of the dare unsettled her. Why did the game want her to go up there? What was waiting for her? A cold shiver ran down her spine as she grabbed her phone and keys, glancing one last time at the bloodied symbol on her arm before stepping into the hallway. The eerie silence of the building amplified her growing paranoia. Her footsteps echoed as she climbed the stairs, each step heavy with uncertainty. When she reached the door to the rooftop, her hand hovered over the handle. She wasn't sure what she expected to find on the other side, but part of her dreaded opening it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another warning.
5 minutes remaining.
Claire pushed open the door. The night air was cold and crisp, a welcome contrast to the suffocating tension she felt inside. The rooftop was empty. just like it always was. She stepped forward, feeling the rough concrete beneath her shoes. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and for a brief moment, the normalcy of it all almost made her forget what she was doing. But then her phone buzzed again.
You have arrived. Wait for further instructions.
Wait. Claire's heart raced as she glanced around, trying to figure out what the game was up to. She felt exposed up here, alone and vulnerable under the open sky. The wind whipped through her hair as she paced the rooftop, the anxiety building with every passing second. Suddenly, her phone chimed.
Look to your left.
Claire's stomach twisted as she turned her head, her eyes scanning the rooftop. There, near the edge, was a small package. It hadn't been there when she'd first come up. She was sure of it. Her hands shook as she approached it, the adrenaline making her legs feel weak. She crouched down, eyeing the package warily. It was plain and nondescript, wrapped in brown paper. There was no label, no clue as to where it had come from. But Claire already knew. It was from the game. Her phone buzzed again, and her heart sank as she read the message.
Open it.
Her hands trembled as she peeled back the paper, revealing a small black box. The box was lightweight, almost too light, as if whatever was inside was delicate or dangerous. She hesitated for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. Then she opened the box. Inside was a single item, a photograph. Her blood ran cold as she pulled it out, her eyes widening in shock. It was a picture of her. Not just any picture, one taken tonight. She was standing in front of her window, the same window the game had told her to stand in front of earlier. Someone had been watching her. Her phone buzzed.
Next question, how many states are in the United States?
Claire felt sick. She barely registered the question, her mind spinning as she clutched the photograph in her hand. Someone was following her, monitoring her every move. The game wasn't just random. It was personal. And it was watching. Her fingers shook as she typed the answer. 50.
Correct.
Another dare appeared, and this one sent a chill straight down her spine.
Dare. Go to the apartment below yours. Do not knock. Enter.
Her breath hitched. Go into the apartment below hers, the one she barely knew anything about. She had passed by it 100 times, but whoever lived there was practically a ghost. No noise, no movement, nothing. The thought of breaking in, of invading someone's space like that, made her sick. Her phone buzzed again, pushing her forward.
You have 15 minutes.
Claire stood frozen on the rooftop, the photograph still clutched in her trembling hand. Her mind reeled. Someone had taken this picture of her while she stood by her window, just like the game had ordered her to. Someone had been watching her all along. Her phone buzzed again, reminding her of the dare waiting below.
Dare. Go to the apartment below yours. Do not knock. Enter.
She had no idea who lived in that apartment. She barely even knew if anyone lived there at all. She had always passed it without a second thought, but now it loomed in her mind, like a dark, unexplored cavern. Breaking into someone's apartment was crossing another line she wasn't sure she could stomach. But what choice did she have? Her breath came in shallow gasps as she made her way back down the stairs, the dimly lit hallway feeling more like a prison than ever before. She reached the door of the apartment below hers and paused, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't have a plan. What if someone was inside? What would she say? The fear of what could happen if she didn't follow the dare loomed larger than her fears of being caught. Her phone buzzed again.
You have 10 minutes.
Claire wiped her sweaty palms on her jeans, her hand shaking as she reached for the doorknob. To her surprise, it turned easily. It wasn't locked. A new wave of anxiety crashed over her. Why wasn't it locked? She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as the heavy door gave way. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the hallway, spilling in through the doorway. She stepped inside, her breath hitching. The air felt stale, like no one had been here in a long time. The door clicked shut behind her, plunging the room into near-complete darkness. Claire stood still, her senses on high alert. There was no sound, no movement, only the sound of her own racing heartbeat in her ears. Her phone buzzed in her pocket.
"You've entered. Walk further."
The message was a command, one that sent a shiver down her spine. Slowly, she took a few tentative steps into the apartment, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The layout was eerily similar to her own, but something felt deeply wrong about the place. A dim light flickered in the kitchen, and for a second she thought she saw something, a shadow moving in the corner of her eye. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she whipped her head toward the source, but there was nothing. The apartment was silent, still. Her phone buzzed again.
10 steps forward.
Her hands shook as she counted each step, moving deeper into the apartment. She could barely see her surroundings, but her imagination filled in the gaps with terrifying possibilities. What was she doing here? Was she being watched again? She stopped after the 10th step, her breath shaky.
"Turn left."
Claire obeyed, turning into what she knew must be the living room. The faintest outline of furniture was visible in the shadows, but the details were impossible to make out. She felt like she was walking through someone else's life, a life she was never meant to enter. Suddenly, her phone buzzed with another message.
"Look down."
Her pulse quickened. She hesitated, her body screaming at her to leave, to get out of there before it was too late. But her curiosity, and the game's invisible hold on her, compelled her to look. She glanced down at the floor and saw something that made her stomach twist. There, lying at her feet, was a piece of paper. On it was a symbol, a circle with a line through it. The same symbol she had carved into her own arm. Her breath caught in her throat. Why was it here? How did it end up in this apartment? Before she could react, her phone buzzed once more.
"Take the paper and leave."
Her hands shook as she bent down and picked up the paper, the strange symbol staring back at her like a warning. She turned and hurried out of the apartment, her heart racing with every step. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Claire nearly collapsed in relief as she stepped back into the hallway. But the relief was short-lived. The game wasn't done with her yet. Her phone buzzed again.
"Next question. What is the boiling point of water in Celsius?"
Her mind was spinning, barely able to focus, but she forced herself to remember. 100 degrees. She typed it quickly and hit send.
"Correct."
And then came the next dare.
"Dare. Go to the park 2 blocks away. You have 20 minutes.
Claire's knees nearly buckled. It was nearly midnight, and the park would be deserted. Her heart sank as the realization hit her. This wasn't going to stop. The game was leading her somewhere, step by step, dragging her deeper into a world she didn't want to be in. She looked at the clock. The time was ticking down, and her phone buzzed again, urging her to keep moving. With no other choice, Claire grabbed her coat and headed out into the night, the strange paper crumpled in her hand, and the cold wind biting at her skin. The cold air stung Claire's face as she stepped outside, her footsteps echoing in the quiet, empty streets. The park was only 2 blocks away, but every step felt like it took her further from safety, further from any hope of waking up from this nightmare. Her mind was racing. Why the park? What was waiting for her there? The game had already shown that it was watching her, following her every move. And now, with the strange symbol burned into her arm, and on the piece of paper she'd found, Claire felt like she was part of something she didn't understand, She reached the edge of the park, where tall trees loomed in the shadows, their branches swaying in the night breeze. The streetlights were dim, casting eerie pools of yellow on the cracked pavement. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Normally she would have heard the faint sounds of cars passing by, or the distant hum of the city. But tonight, it felt like the world had gone silent. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts.
Enter the park, walk to the center.
Claire swallowed hard, glancing around before stepping onto the gravel path. She could barely make out the outlines of the park's playground equipment and benches in the distance, all swallowed by the darkness. The center of the park was a small clearing, surrounded by trees, where people often gathered during the day. But at this time of night, it felt like a ghostly arena waiting for her arrival. As she walked, her mind replayed everything that had happened since the game began. The stolen chocolate bar, the smashed laptop, the message to her ex, the mark on her arm, each dare pulling her deeper into a sense of helplessness. But this time, it felt different. The park was an open, vulnerable space, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Her phone buzzed again.
You have 5 minutes.
Claire picked up the pace, her shoes crunching against the gravel path as she approached the clearing. Her breath was shallow, her nerves raw. When she finally reached the center of the park, she stopped and looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. Nothing. No one. Her phone buzzed once more.
Turn around.
Claire's blood ran cold. Her hands shook as she slowly turned, dread gnawing at her insides. There, standing on the path behind her, was a figure. It was barely visible in the shadows, standing at the edge of the light. The figure was tall, its face obscured by the hood of a dark jacket. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She took an instinctive step back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs felt frozen. The figure didn't move. Her phone buzzed, but she didn't dare look down. She didn't want to take her eyes off the shadowy figure, afraid that if she did, something worse might happen. Finally, with shaking hands, she lifted her phone to check the message.
Approach the figure. You have 3 minutes.
Every instinct told Claire to run, to scream, to do anything but what the game wanted. But the unseen hand of the game pulled her forward, forcing her to follow its twisted path. Slowly, cautiously, she took a step toward the figure. Her heart pounded in her ears, each beat louder than the last. The figure remained still, its head slightly tilted as if it were watching her every move. Claire took another step, her legs trembling. The distance between them closed, and the figure became clearer in the dim light. Its face was still hidden beneath the hood, but now she could see more, a man wearing dark jeans and boots. His posture was unnerving, too still, too calm. When she was just a few feet away, her phone buzzed again.
Ask the figure, are you part of the game?
Claire's throat went dry. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She felt like she was being swallowed by the darkness, the weight of the game pressing down on her chest. Finally, she forced the words out, her voice barely above a whisper.
Are you part of the game?
The figure didn't respond right away. For a few agonizing moments, they stood in silence, the tension thick in the air. Then slowly, the figure reached up and pulled back the hood. Claire's breath hitched. The face staring back at her was familiar, hauntingly familiar. It was Daniel, her ex. The same man she had texted earlier that night, the man she hadn't seen or spoken to in over a year. His eyes were dark, his expression unreadable. Claire's mind reeled. What was he doing here? How could he be involved in this? Before she could say anything, her phone buzzed again.
Next question. Who invented the light bulb?
She could barely process the question, her mind spinning as she stared at Daniel. The game was toying with her, manipulating her in ways she hadn't imagined. Her fingers shook as she typed the answer. Thomas Edison.
Correct.
Her phone buzzed again, and the next dare appeared.
Dare. Follow Daniel. He will lead you to the next challenge.
She stared at the words, her stomach twisting with dread. The game had been playing with her mind all night, dragging her deeper into this nightmare. But involving Daniel? Was this just another sick twist, or had he been part of the game all along? Daniel didn't say a word. He simply turned and began walking toward the far end of the park, his footsteps eerily silent on the gravel. Claire hesitated. Her instincts are screaming at her to run the other way, but the game's pull was too strong. She couldn't stop now. If she stopped, the consequences would be even worse. With a deep breath, she followed him, her heart racing. The path wound through the trees, and the farther they went, the darker it became. The faint glow of streetlights faded behind them, swallowed by the shadows of the park. Claire kept her distance, watching Daniel's back, her mind struggling to make sense of it all. Finally, they emerged from the trees into another clearing, this one much smaller, surrounded by dense brush. There was nothing here but an old, rusted bench, barely visible in the moonlight. Daniel stopped in front of it, his back still turned to her. Claire felt a chill crawl up her spine. This place felt wrong, like it was forgotten, abandoned, the kind of place where no one would hear you scream. Her phone buzzed again.
Stand in front of Daniel.
Claire swallowed hard and stepped forward. Her legs felt like they were moving on autopilot, her body responding to the game's commands, even though her mind was screaming to stop. When she reached him, Daniel slowly turned to face her. The coldness in his eyes sent a wave of fear through her. This wasn't the Daniel she had known. This wasn't the person she had loved. He felt like a stranger, someone who had been pulled into the game, just like her. Her phone buzzed again.
Next question. What element does O represent on the periodic table?
The game was relentless, never giving her a moment to catch her breath. Claire forced herself to focus, to push aside the growing fear and confusion. She typed the answer. Oxygen.
Correct.
The next dare appeared, and this one made her stomach drop.
Dare. Take the knife from Daniel's pocket, cut his hand.
Claire's heart stopped. She stared at the screen, her mouth dry, unable to process what she had just read. Cut him? Hurt him? This had to be a mistake. The game had asked her to do strange, invasive things before, but this was different. This was violence. She looked up at Daniel, her breath catching in her throat. He stood there, still and silent, as if waiting for her to act. There was no expression on his face, no emotion in his eyes, just an empty stare. Her phone buzzed again, more insistent this time.
Take the knife.
Claire's hands shook as she reached out, her fingers brushing against Daniel's jacket pocket. She hesitated, her mind screaming at her to stop, but she couldn't. The game had her trapped, and the fear of what would happen if she refused was too great. She slipped her hand into his pocket and felt the cold metal of the knife. It was small, barely the size of her palm, but the weight of it in her hand felt like 1,000 pounds. Her phone buzzed again.
Cut his hand, you have 5 minutes.
Tears welled in Claire's eyes. She couldn't do this. She couldn't hurt him, even if he wasn't the person she remembered. But the game wouldn't stop. It wouldn't let her walk away. With trembling hands, she reached out and grabbed Daniel's hand. His skin was warm, and for a brief moment, the familiarity of his touch made her pause. Memories of their time together, before everything went wrong, flashed through her mind. But this wasn't the same. Nothing was the same anymore. She raised the knife, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Her grip tightened as she pressed the blade against his skin, just enough to draw a thin line of blood. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't react at all. Her phone buzzed.
Dare completed. Well done, Claire.
Claire dropped the knife, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. What had she just done? Why hadn't he reacted? She looked at Daniel, expecting some kind of response, but he remained motionless, as if nothing had happened. Her phone buzzed again, and Claire's body tensed.
Next question. What is the atomic number of carbon?
She could barely think, her mind too clouded with fear and regret. But the answer came to her like a reflex. 6.
Correct.
The next dare appeared, and it felt like a punch to the gut.
Dare. Follow Daniel into the woods. The final challenge awaits.
Claire's heart raced as she read the message on her phone. The final challenge. The words hung in her mind like a noose tightening around her. She looked up at Daniel, standing still as ever, his hand bloodied from the cut she had made. His face remained blank, eerily detached from the situation. The woods. The park already felt isolated, but the trees beyond the clearing loomed like an impenetrable wall of darkness. It was the kind of place you'd only enter if you had no other choice. And right now, Claire felt like she had none. Her phone buzzed again, the relentless push of the game driving her forward.
You have 10 minutes.
Claire's feet moved before her mind could catch up. She fell in step behind Daniel, her body numb with fear and exhaustion. He led the way, walking without a word or glance back. The path grew narrower as they entered the woods, the thick branches overhead blocking out the moonlight. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Every step felt heavier than the last. Claire's senses were on high alert, every creak and whisper of the forest making her jump. It felt like the woods were swallowing her, pulling her deeper into some kind of twisted game she didn't understand. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the darkness pressing in on her from all sides. Just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, they emerged into another clearing, this one smaller and more secluded. In the center of the clearing was something that made Claire's blood run cold. A chair. Not just any chair. It looked old, weathered by time and the elements. It sat alone in the center of the clearing, bathed in the pale glow of the moon that managed to filter through the trees. There was something deeply unsettling about it, as if it had been waiting for her. Daniel stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to face her. His expression remained blank, but his presence felt heavier now, more ominous. Her phone buzzed.
Sit in the chair.
Claire's legs wobbled beneath her. Sit? Here? In this place that felt like the end of the world. She couldn't do it. Her body screamed to run, to escape this nightmare, but she knew the game wouldn't let her. Her phone buzzed again, a reminder that time was running out.
You have 5 minutes.
Claire took a deep breath, every muscle in her body tense with fear. Slowly, she stepped forward, her feet dragging as she approached the chair. The air felt thicker here, as if it were closing in on her with every breath she took. When she finally reached the chair, she hesitated. Sitting in it felt like surrender, like giving herself over to whatever dark force was controlling the game. But she had no choice. She lowered herself into the seat, her body trembling as the cold wood pressed against her skin. Her phone buzzed again.
Now tie your hands to the chair. Use the rope under the seat.
Claire's stomach lurched. She glanced down and, sure enough, saw a length of rope coiled under the chair. Her hands shook as she reached for it, her mind racing. This was it, the final challenge. She was about to hand herself over completely. With trembling fingers, she looped the rope around her wrists, securing them to the arms of the chair. Every fiber of her being screamed to stop, but the game's hold on her was too strong. She tied the knots, tightening them just enough to hold her in place. Her phone buzzed.
Dare completed.
She waited, her heart pounding, every nerve in her body on edge. The clearing was deathly silent, and the darkness around her seemed to pulse with an unspoken threat. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at Daniel, who stood motionless at the edge of the trees, watching. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again, and this time the message made her blood turn to ice.
Final question. Why did you break up with Daniel?
The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mind reeled as memories of their relationship flooded back. The arguments, the fights, the emotional distance that had grown between them. She had left because she couldn't take it anymore. Because Daniel had changed. But now, seeing him here, she couldn't help but wonder if she had ever truly known him. Her hands shook as she tried to type out an answer, but her mind was a fog of confusion and fear. She managed to type, "We grew apart." Her phone buzzed, the message glaring at her.
Incorrect.
Claire's heart dropped. Incorrect? She had answered honestly, hadn't she? Her phone buzzed again, and this time the next dare appeared.
Dare, tell Daniel the truth. You have 5 minutes.
The truth. Claire's thoughts spiraled. She had told him the truth, hadn't she? She stared at Daniel, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. He stepped closer, his face still expressionless, as if waiting for her to speak. The truth. Claire's mind flashed back to the last few months of their relationship. There was something she hadn't told him, something that had haunted her after they broke up. But now it seemed irrelevant, lost in the chaos of this twisted game. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper as she finally spoke.
I was afraid of what you were becoming. I didn't recognize you anymore.
Daniel didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching her, the silence between them stretching out like a void. Her phone buzzed.
Final dare, close your eyes.
Claire's breath caught in her throat. She hesitated, her mind screaming that something was terribly wrong. But there was no way out now, no more questions, no more choices. With a deep, shaky breath, she closed her eyes. The world around her went silent. The darkness behind Claire's eyelids felt infinite, pressing down on her as if the world around her had disappeared. She sat in the cold, creaking chair, her hands tied, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence stretched on, unbearable in its weight. Her phone hadn't buzzed again. There were no more instructions, no more questions. It was as if the game had suddenly stopped. But Claire knew better. This wasn't over. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body frozen in place. She listened, straining to hear any movement, any sign of what was coming next. Daniel was still out there. She could sense his presence even with her eyes closed. She could feel him watching her, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. And then the silence broke. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, echoed through the clearing, growing closer with each passing second. Claire's pulse quickened, her heart thudding painfully against her rib cage. The sound of the steps was heavy, filled with purpose like the approach of something inevitable. She clenched her hands into fists, her knuckles white as she sat in the chair, waiting for what came next. She had no control now. The game had taken that from her long ago. The footsteps stopped. She could feel someone standing right in front of her, the presence looming over her like a shadow. Her breath hitched in her throat. And then, a voice, cold, flat, and familiar.
Claire.
Daniel's voice. Her heart stopped. She hadn't heard him speak in what felt like hours, and now the sound of his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She kept her eyes closed, every fiber of her being screaming not to open them. The game had told her to keep them closed. Whatever happened next, she couldn't look.
I never understood why you left.
Daniel said, his voice low and devoid of emotion.
But now I do.
Claire's throat tightened, her body trembling as his words hung in the air. She didn't know what to say, what to feel. This wasn't the Daniel she knew. This was something else, something twisted by the game. He took another step closer, and she could feel his breath on her skin.
You couldn't handle it, could you? The truth. You ran.
Claire wanted to scream, to shout that it wasn't true, but the fear had frozen her voice. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, every muscle in her body tense. The silence stretched out again, long and unbearable. Then, without warning, she felt his hand on her arm, his fingers cold and unyielding. He gripped her tightly, and Claire's body tensed in terror. Her phone buzzed. She flinched, the sound loud and jarring in the heavy silence. Slowly, her shaking hand fumbled for her phone, her fingers brushing against the screen as she pulled it into her lap. She opened her eyes just enough to see the message.
Game over.
Her heart stuttered. Game over? What did that mean? Was it really over? Daniel's grip tightened for a moment, then released. Claire's breath came in sharp gasps as she slowly opened her eyes, her vision blurry with tears. Daniel stood there, still as a statue, his face unreadable in the dim moonlight. Her phone buzzed again, the final message blinking on the screen.
You survived.
Survived. The word echoed in her mind, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt hollow, like the game had taken more from her than she could understand. She had survived, but at what cost? Daniel stepped back, his expression unreadable. He turned and walked toward the edge of the clearing, disappearing into the woods without another word. Claire watched him go, her body too weak to move. The silence settled in once again, thick and oppressive. She sat there for a long time, her mind numb, her heart still racing. The game was over, but the weight of everything she had done, everything she had been forced to do, lingered like a dark cloud over her. Finally, her trembling hands worked the ropes free from her wrists, and she stood on shaky legs. The chair creaked as she pushed away from it, her body aching from the tension. She glanced around the clearing one last time, searching for any sign of Daniel. But he was gone. Claire looked down at her phone, the final message still glowing on the screen.
You survived.
But in her heart, she knew that surviving didn't mean winning. She turned and walked back through the woods, the cold night air biting at her skin. The game was over, but the memory of it would haunt her forever.